This podcast is brought to you by Shift Management's Supervisory Leadership Certificate course, where online learning and live web coaching bring out the very best in frontline and middle managers. Move from operations to management thinking and develop the skills for leadership, reaching your company goals at the same time. Check out our Supervisory Leadership Certificate course on the shiftworkplace.com website today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. Today, my special guest is Kamal Sinclair. Kamal Sinclair is incubating collaboration among people that are imagining and prototyping bold ideas about the future. She does this as the executive director of the Guild of Future Architects, supporting independent artists as a senior consultant for Sundance Institute. Kamal makes art through a family creative practice called Sinclair Futures. Previously, she served as the director of Sundance Institute's New Frontier Labs program, which supports artists working at the convergence of film, art, media, and technology, and as an artist and producer on Question Bridge, Blackmails. So I'm really excited to host Kamal today because she has such an amazing bio and has had a very amazing life. And I'm excited to hear what she has to tell us about leadership and the arts and technology and the future of work. So Kamal, can you fill us in a little bit more about your personal background and let the audience know more about who you are as a person?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast, and being able to have a conversation with you is a delight. I come from all of this as an artist. I was a cast member of Stomp for 6 years. I ran a theater company in New York City back in the 90s. I come from art and theater. I went to Tisch Experimental Theater Wing. The kind of beginning of my career as not only a actor and theater maker, dancer, was really focused on kind of the intersection of live performing arts and social justice and entertainment, which is a wonderful time in my life. And then I started to see these kind of disparities between the incredible, work that I was doing at Stomp and seeing this, one of the most profitable shows ever on Off-Broadway, being with the company for 6 years, and seeing it kind of contrasted to this incredible, rich community of artists in the downtown and Brooklyn kind of New York scene in the 90s that, were struggling to get access to an 80-seat house or to rehearsal space and that kind of thing. And so I really was curious on how I could help to bridge those gaps and be a steward of resources to not only bring more sustainable careers to the community I was so in love with, but also to kind of help platform more diverse voices that were kind of penetrating into the kind of arts platforms that were getting more visibility. And so I went back to school and got my master's in business at Georgia State. And that was at the dawn of social media. So literally YouTube and Twitter were just coming online when I was in my grad program. And my first gig was working with Fractured Atlas and the Woodruff Art Center in Atlanta. And there was a big conversation about how do we bridge the gap between what's happening in culture making and creative spaces online and digital spaces and the kind of broadcast new access to tools and distribution, and what was happening in these brick and mortar spaces like the Woodruff Art Center. And that led me to really be able to see some of the early thinking around transmedia, culture making and storytelling and media making. When I got a call from one of my dear friends from New York University, Hank Willis Thomas, who had kind of blown up as a conceptual artist in the art world, and he was doing this project called Question Bridge, Blackmails. And at the time, he was thinking of it as a video installation or maybe a documentary. And I brought some of this learning about how to kind of make some porous relationships between this new digital social culture and brick and mortar spaces. And that led to Question Bridge becoming a transmedia art project, and a really exciting one. It was a landmark project. It's now archived at the Smithsonian African American Museum. We went to Sundance through the New Frontier program's first lab and went to the exhibition in 2012. And that led to me kind of becoming a transmedia artist and producer, and then being invited by Sundance to run the New Frontier Lab program. And that gave me a 7-year connection to such an incredible community of innovators at the intersection of art, science, technology. And the further I got into that world, I started seeing another potential pitfall around making sure that those resources were also better distributed than in innovation cycles past. And that led me to the work I'm doing now around a research project called Making a New Reality, looking at furthering equality in emerging media and to democratizing the imagination of the future and who gets to define how we're going to use these exponential technologies for culture making and for society making.
Wow, that is a beautiful, articulate response to that question. Tell me what you do and who you are.
Well, thank you for letting me go on and on. Tell the full story.
I'm just going to ask a few questions for the sake of the listeners who may not know what some of the things are that you were mentioning. And one of them is Stomp. I saw Stomp twice. The first time I saw it, I was speechless for an hour afterward because I was so blown away by what it was. I'd like to ask you to explain what is Stomp to any of the audience who has not seen it, any of our listeners.
Certainly. It is a show that started in London as a group of percussionists busking on the streets of London and Brighton, England. And then they started to formulate that into a band, and they were busking on the streets, making music out of trash cans and brooms and like all of these found objects in our everyday life. That went to the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh and then to Toronto and got picked up by a Broadway producer and came to New York in the mid-90s. And it's still going.
Yeah, it's like a musical that's been everywhere all over the world. And anyone who hasn't seen it, it's like right up there with things you should see, like Fiddler on the Roof and Jesus Christ Superstar and Cats.
Yes, it's a classic now.
It is, yeah.
At the time when I joined it, it was the new kind of grunge, fringe thing, and now it's like classic.
It was like musical theater meets grunge and and street busking. Anyway, it's really worth seeing. So that was where you started, and then after that, you went to a number of different places. So we were talking about intersections of technology, science, and the arts, and you're talking about social media and how you kind of grew with social media through all of this. What I'm wondering is, how did you manage to do all of those things at once? Like, it just seems really multidisciplinary immediately. And I can understand how that got to question bridge black males, but I'm sort of wondering, how did you find yourself in this transdisciplinary space before transdiscipline was even a word?
Yeah, it was my job at the Woodruff Art Center as a consultant to their strategy department, their strategic development department, was to look at the future of this billion-dollar net worth institution that had the High Museum. It had great program for arts education throughout Georgia. It served 600,000 youth a year through the Georgia Public Schools. It had the, regional theater, the symphony. It was just a very rich campus. But it was going through, something that a lot of brick and mortar arts institutions were going through at the time, and I think still going through, and that was the drop-off of patronage and visitorship from younger audiences, the young professionals and the youth. So it was a kind of an aging patronage, and that aging patronage, there was a real call to bring in new audiences within the brick and mortar fine arts institutions in America. And the other thing is that it was the predominant subscriber base and visitorship was not necessarily representative of Atlanta, which was an incredibly diverse city. There wasn't the same kind of representation on the campus. So the idea was, how do we open up programming? How do we create different kinds of programming so that people really feel like this is their home and their art center? And while I was doing this work around developing new audiences and also working with the kind of hip hop community there, had made a lot of money through the music industry and were just starting to connect with their roles as they approached their late 30s and 40s as civically engaged people of the city of Atlanta. So it was kind of this really interesting mix of the kind of traditional players from politics and commerce and then culture and this kind of new leadership that was coming in. So we were like working with all this stuff, right? And that's when I just started Googling and researching and finding out, how do you build new audiences in this age? And I came across things like virtual museums and the way at the time Second Life had kind of been this great gathering place. How are people kind of finding ways to have a brick and mortar space transcend the brick and mortar into those kind of virtual spaces? How do you, allow for people to feel empowered by the tools of YouTube and so forth, and to still kind of share that work on a fine arts campus, and who gets to be the artist. I remember there was a big question at the time around democratizing the arts in general, and do you have to have an MFA to be considered an artist, and how do you create space for that range of creative expression on these kind of arts campuses. And that really kind of sent me down the rabbit hole. That's where I discovered, through the research I was doing, the National Film Board of Canada and their pioneering work in interactive documentary, interactive media. Kat Cizik, I came across her work. She's one of the kind of godmothers of interactive documentary. Came across her work around high rises, and I was just blown away. She was doing 360 video way before, the kind of virtual reality push. I came across Claire Reddington's work with Playable Cities and how she was working with museums to kind of break brick and mortar and have happenings and kind of geo-tagged work through mapping systems on websites to connect. This is before like the geocache stuff on our phones.
I would say you're both really open and curious. You were in a petri dish of opportunity. You have an underlying foundation of social justice that informs your work. And then on top of that, you also had opportunities that just sort of happened because you were in the right place in the right time. I'm just sort of thinking this.
Yeah, that's fair. And I would say I got to the right place at the right time, partly because of my relationships that I made as an undergrad at New York University and people in that network inviting me to connect to their network. So it was a wonderful time in my early 30s to see how the peer-to-peer network evolves.
Well, everything's always about networking and relationships. So let me get into the question about, from the groups that you were born into, what would you say has most influenced your sense of culture and your sense of self, your sense of leadership? Because you've talked about all of those terms. And I mean, you were born into a context. What was that context like? How did that influence?
In terms of arts leadership, I would say my very first opportunity to kind of embody that role happened when I was a youth. I was part of a youth workshop from the time I was 9 years old till I was 18. And so that was a 9-year career working in a youth theater group, arts group that met every weekend, toured all over the country. The work was generated by the youth themselves. So I kind of early on, because I had training as a dancer and a theater maker, I was given the kind of wheel to kind of drive some of that art making, to choreograph and to direct, and to help with the administrative work of organizing our tours. And then I went to the High School for the Arts in LA, which also gave me the reins to get my first directing complete from top to bottom, writing script, everything, to direct theater and work with artists. So I would say I got the bug really early.
You got the bug really early, but that you weren't born into a theater group. Like, I'm just wondering, what was your early childhood like? Your family? Where did you live? I'm going back into... Well,
let me tell you, I was born into a theater group.
What, inside a theater? That's where you were born?
But no, I come from an art family. So my father was a musician and he used to manage bands. My uncle was with the Olympics in the 16s and the 50s, where it's just one of the, big garage bands that blew up in the top 40 charts. We had already a great investment in the arts in my family. My uncle was a theater maker. He had done a couple of really well-received plays in New York and LA. So, and then my older brother and sister were members of this same theater group. When I was 3 years old, I was in the back of the group in my disco skirt. The Baha'i Youth Workshop is the name of the group. And I would be in the back of the room, trying to do my little disco dances. So I got it was my life from an early age. I was following them on short-term tours when I was 8 on my summer break. So yeah, I was definitely into that culture.
Yeah, you really truly were born into an arts family. And then the Baha'i Youth Workshop is probably a group that, I don't know if it exists anymore, but at the time it would have been a group that would have influenced your sense of self and culture and also the social justice perspective, I imagine.
Yes, and through that I got an opportunity at 12 years old. I was performing in LA with the theater group, and someone had seen me and made a recommendation to the Australian theater group called the Wildfire Theater Group. And they were on a South Asian tour, and they needed someone that with great dance skills. And they called me up, and I was 12 years old, and they basically said, "Hey, do you want to join us on this tour? So I took a semester off of the 8th grade, and I went to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, Macau, China, and then over to New Zealand to work with another youth group called Youth for One World. And we toured the North Island of New Zealand for 2 months. So I was gone for a full semester and got a real sense of what it means to be engaged with a global community of artists.
No kidding. And a global community of artists in specific national context, too.
And that changed me. I was going to a middle school that was really caught up in the height of the Blood and Crip Wars in Los Angeles. You know, there was a lot of violence on my campus. And I just remember standing on a rice field in China going, oh my God, we're fighting over this little tiny block in this one little city street. Like, you know, when there's a whole world out here. And all I could think about was, oh my God, if the 400, 500 kids that went to my school could stand on this rice field in China, they would see how ridiculous this energy being spent fighting over this turf was. So that was one of those transformational moments for me.
Yeah, the power of the arts, and in nature, there you are in the rice field with the world around you, the planet around you, thinking, why are we fighting over things when we all need to eat? We all share the same space, the same air. So it sounds like the family, the arts opportunities that you had, and the international travel that you had has really shaped you. And how would you say that's affected your leadership?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I remember when I was doing this transition, I had 2 small children, and I was transitioning from being an artist, a maker, to going to get this MBA and going into more of a steward of the arts. I just remember kind of going into this kind of deep meditation and saying, okay, how can I be a steward of the arts? And the first thing that kind of ran through my body was fear of the responsibility, fear of the ways in which power over resources would impact my ego. And I was recalling people that had been stewards of resources for social good that I thought had done a very good job, where they weren't just about self-aggrandizement and all of these things. And I kind of really tried to step into their wake and tried to adopt a set of principles that would allow me to do that. But it was a really interesting moment, like how to balance knowing what it's like to be a starving artist, knowing what it's like to have these incredible transformative works never getting seen by more than 80 people, and then kind of quickly foisted into a position of being a gatekeeper over resources. And I remember having this one like kind of 9-month stint of my own ego being deeply tested by the seduction of privilege that comes with those things. And starting to think, starting to think about it like it's you, you know what I mean? When it's not. It was only this 9-month period, but it was a huge wake-up call.
How easy it is to fall into thinking, I am the be-all and the end-all, and it's all because of me.
Yeah, it was more about these tiny little rationalizations that would start to come into your head around, oh, well, I'll make this one little compromise on this slightly questionable ethical whatever, because that'll bring in more resources to help more people. And in the end of the day, I was like, you know what? Some of those rationalizations were just because it was very nice to be standing in front of a press wall with, you know, a former ambassador, you know, did this, that, and the other. And you kind of start to feel like you're now in the insiders club, and you start to then adopt some of the rationale around, I would say, less, maybe not even ethical, might even be too strong of a word, but just kind of ways in which resources are managed that are a little bit more self-serving than community serving or field serving. And I just remember having these tiny little things happening and then I like stopped and had due reflection and said, okay, this is what the seduction of privilege looks like. You start to make these tiny little compromises. Now, I'm not saying compromise is a bad thing in general. Obviously, this is all about a negotiation of our shared resources, and compromise is part of that. But when it's compromises that really aren't, they're in the service of yourself rather than the service of the constituencies that you're serving as a steward, that's when it gets dangerous.
Oh, thank you for nuancing that, because it reminded me of that whole piece of how basically whenever any of us have any resources or access to resources or privilege, it automatically insulates us against the suffering of others and puts us into a position where we start to see ourselves in small ways as being above or separate from other people. And I think that that's the danger. that sense of being removed from the effect of our actions. When you're a struggling artist, you see the effect of your actions immediately. And when you're a gatekeeper of resources, you're not exactly sure how those actions will affect people over time. And you may only realize it later. And by then, you didn't even know you were making a compromise at the time. That's how gradual I think it would be.
Yeah, there's definitely some wake-up calls when you're in those positions. Like I'll tell you an example. This is something that is a little bit different than the seduction of privilege side, but just the blindness of privilege that can happen sometimes. I was in conversation. We just showed a piece that very much, like, kind of in the documentary world specifically, there was a big push, and I was kind of a big, I would say, evangelist for this, of changing the practice of the outsider telling other people's stories. And not that someone from an outside can't be reflective and share a story about what they're observing that's not useful, but if it's the only mode of sharing stories, especially of marginalized people that haven't had the resources to tell their own stories, there's a lot of loss in translation and
misunderstandings and projections.
Yeah. And so there was a big push to make sure that we're resourcing people to tell their own stories and to make sure there's a robust representation of a lot of different identities being able to tell their own stories. And so there was one particular project that in my mind had really represented this, someone from a marginalized identity group having the resources to tell their own story. And it wasn't until later that I found out that there was another kind of dynamic that happens when a powerful institution or people that are coming from a powerful or wealthy country like the USA go into other places and say, hey, let me bring resources so you can tell your own stories. And there's been such a challenged inequity in those relationships for so long, the kind of legacy of colonialism, that someone finally told me, they were like, that is actually not the authentic story of this community and this people, or probably even that person that told the story. This is their assumption of what the Americans needed to hear from us to be able to get the resources in the door. In this particular case, telling a story of a kind of gender equality, but it was told in the voice of a Western feminist woman, that instead of, the person that I was speaking with was saying, actually in our culture, it's a totally different framework around gender equality than, because we don't have the same issues that, Western patriarchal feminist issues, have. We never had adopted some of those Western patriarchal identities. So it doesn't even make sense what this person is saying, because it doesn't even make sense for the particular kind of gender issues that exist in this community. But they didn't think that a Westerner would ever understand.
It reminds me of Lisa C's book, where she does her autobiography and talks about how the Chinatowns that emerged in the United States were the result of the Chinese trying to attract resources when the cities were saying that they would bulldoze the Chinatowns down. And the Chinese said, well, no, because, people will want to come and see Chinatown and see how the Chinese live. And they made it completely fabricated the way they thought the Americans wanted to see Chinatown. Facades and Chinatowns that had nothing to do with being Chinese and living as Chinese in the United States. And that it was a complete facade. It was a complete fake reality. And it was because they didn't think that the people that had the resources had any capacity to understand their reality. So they didn't even bother going there. It was too dangerous for them to speak.
Yeah. As a cultural leader, as someone who is in a position, and, I also want to make the distinction that just because someone is a cultural leader doesn't mean that they are personally well-financed. And that also creates this weird ivory tower dynamic where, working at a nonprofit, even a high-functioning and, prestigious nonprofit, it's still a nonprofit, and there's a lot of frugality, and your paychecks are, they're frugal. Mm-hmm. And so it's such an interesting dynamic, being an arts leader versus, I would say, being a kind of a CEO within, kind of a tech world or these other kind of spaces where leadership comes with other kinds of privilege other than just gatekeeper status.
Yeah, and being an arts leader, you're actually doing transcendent work that will probably affect generations to come. So we talked about groups you were born into. Groups you've adopted, I would say, have been a variety of things, right? Because you grew into the not-for-profit world, you grew into university and college arts campuses, you grew into the MBA world, and then the tech world. What would you say influenced you now as an adult? What things are contributing to how you see yourself in the world now?
It's interesting. I mean, if I had money in the bank that I could do whatever I wanted to do with my day-to-day life, I would want to go back to making art. And I still do, like right now I am working on a documentary called The Radical Imagination Project, which is serving to kind of scratch that itch. But it's another one of those fundamental kind of tensions as in the arts leadership space, because artists that understand the arts, that understand why this is so important to invest and maybe communicate that to donors or philanthropic organizations, or to try to translate those resources into supports for the arts. They're also oftentimes artists themselves, not everybody, but there's a lot of people that I know within Sundance and all these different arts administrative organizations that are just filled with artists that have something that's boiling inside of them to say. That at some point they're like, before I die, I have to just say this, not because I need to be a blockbuster, bestseller, Pulitzer Prize winner or something. It's just because it has to get out of my soul before I die.
Right.
It's like there's this drive as an artist.
I know what Sundance is, but maybe there are people listening who don't know what Sundance is. Can you just tell us, what is Sundance?
Certainly. Sundance is a nonprofit organization that supports independent storytellers. And although the primary medium that people know Sundance for is film, because Robert Redford was the founder and has been the steward of this organization for the last 40 years, there's always been other modes of storytelling that Sundance has supported, including an amazing theater program, this interdisciplinary program called New Frontier, which is getting up to upwards of 15 years old now. We've had a dance program in the past, so it's a great champion of independent storytellers.
Most people think of Sundance as being the film festival, but it's really much bigger than that, isn't it?
Oh yeah, there is the film festival, which is obviously our big signature program for the public. But year round, we are doing artist labs where we're supporting screen writers labs, episodic storytelling labs, theater labs, art and technology labs, both week-long, multi-week retreats up at the Sundance Resort in Utah, but also through programming with partner organizations all over the country and the world. So it's got a really rich history of supporting storytellers globally.
Thanks for defining that. The thing that you were talking about before I so rudely interrupted you was about the groups that have affected you growing up. And you said, well, really, you would just go back to doing art if you could. But what about other things?
Well, I would say that artist in me that is always driving some storytelling to happen or some kind of making of work to happen. But I'm also somebody who happens to be able to create a strategic plan and manage a budget and do the work of stewarding the arts. And so I definitely feel the pull between both, and the work that I'm doing on that side of things right now, working very heavily on trying to democratize the imagination of our future through creative production and through working with communities to kind of create co-created space, co-created visions of what our future might be as we try to navigate climate crisis and the future of work with artificial intelligence, the ethics around bioengineering, like how do we, through storytelling and through the arts and through cultural production, try to create a collective understanding of how we want to wield these exponential powers and these kind of exponential challenges. I would say that is a key thing that all the work I'm doing, whether it be my own creative practice with this documentary or through the Guild of Future Architects or through the Future Culture Initiative at Sundance or through the board work that I do with organizations like iBeam or the MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality. Ultimately, it's all trying to create that more inclusive and intersectional space to grapple with our vision of the future.
I just saw a really interesting production done by a San Francisco classical East Indian dance theater group that was trying to create expression of climate change issues and coming to grips with living, in relationship with the planet through East Indian classical mythology. It was really interesting to hear what the audience had to say afterwards, because it was mostly an Indian audience. And they were, oh, well, that was different. And I went to the person who created the dance theater piece, and it was absolutely stunning. And I said, I was just so blown away about what a wonderful job you're doing with really bringing the classical Indian dance into modern issues and the concerns of the day. And she looked around me and she said, yeah, I really wish that my target group would actually see why this matters. They just want to be entertained. They just want a spectacle. And I was wondering if you run into that problem of, as you're trying to create spaces for the imagination to exist in a democratized way, if the audiences keep saying, yeah, just entertain me, I don't want to deal with this, or if you're not experiencing that, I don't know. She said this is her main issue.
That's a really good question. I think I haven't had as direct a resistance. Maybe it's because the audiences that are engaging with kind of independent storytelling are a little bit more game to be challenged in those ways. But definitely when I think about the work that we've been doing at the intersection of like gaming and film and storytelling, like I wouldn't say I've seen more of the apathetics even though like I just came from a Gates Foundation hackathon on changing narratives around poverty in America, because there's a lot of misinformation and unhelpful assumptions around why people are poor that make it really challenging to change the poverty rates and so forth and issues that impact the poor. And Good, which you may be familiar with, good.com, they did a kind of a deep research into how Americans see poverty as an issue, right? And it was divided on a 25%, 25%, 25%, 25% pie, where there was the kind of progressives, which I would probably fall into the category. And the problem with that quadrant was that there's like 1,000 issues and the progressives are trying to tackle all of them. And it becomes a really fragmented space for trying to shift mindsets, right? And then you have the group that is more conservative and saying, hey, let people be people. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, or, like they need to take care of themselves. I'll take care of myself, kind of this more completely hands off. And then there was a quadrant that was called the apathetics. And interestingly, they were majority young men who had the attitude of, I just want to have my little piece of the rock, have my apartment, have my car, and have fun and not have to really deal with the weight of the world. And then there was the strivers, they called them, 25% of people that may have even come from poverty themselves, but were the outliers that escaped some of the challenges that create a kind of a cycle of poverty. And they had kind of a less empathetic relationship with the issue and saying, hey, I made it out myself. You can do it too. And I'm just trying to keep myself out of that condition. So I'm just going to stay focused on what's keeping me in mind on our feet. And so I think that is kind of a better representation of, or some, what I've come across recently that articulates what you're talking about. My own work. So much
more nuanced. You're saying
over talking.
Your own work, you were saying.
Yeah, I was saying in my own work, I see more of a difference between those that are kind of waking up to certain things, because I think the way that I'm trying to frame things is not as a you're bad, we're good kind of a framework, but this is an opportunity that we have right now. I was at an event in England. I'd given a talk on the research I'd done for the Ford Foundation called Making a Reality. And she said, I'm really down for this. How do we get, in her words, how do we get white people to give up some of what they have so other groups can come to the table? And I was really appreciated the question and her eagerness. And she has a deep practice of creating inclusive environments as a white woman for more people to come to the table. So she's really coming from a very sincere place. But I actually realized how struck I was by the framing, because in my mind, it wasn't a zero-sum scenario. And I didn't see white people in the surplus and everybody else in the deficit. I actually saw white people in this construction of assuming white power, white wealth, white privilege as being in a deficit themselves. Because if there's a table that is homogenous and doesn't include the wealth of human potential that's surrounding that table, and you're not being able to benefit from any of that potential, and to me, that actually, even though it looks like you're in a position of power, wealth, and privilege, it actually is a position of severe lack, because the person that might be able to cure the cancer that you're going to die of could be just on the outskirts of that table and not have the tuition to go get their education to unlock that particular contribution to society. So I think that trying to reframe.
It's not just material or access to material resources, it's poverty on every other level. When I was working on my doctoral research, I was working with 9 teachers, all from different countries, 2 of whom had come to Canada as refugees. And halfway through the research, I said to them, I wish that every child in the world would have all of you as their teacher, because everybody, no matter where they live, is completely handicapped by only being exposed to the culture and the region that's around them. And having teachers who are, forming the minds of children and youth who have such a limited experience can only be overcome by bringing in more teachers from other limited experiences. Think how handicapped the entire human race is because we have not been able to see and accept the gift of each of you. It just hit me that we're all in our own little tiny bubble. And until we burst the bubble and look around to see who's sitting around us and be open to receiving what they have to offer, imagine what the human race could be. It was just mind-blowing to imagine it. when people say, oh yeah, if it's too bad white people won't give up what they have, it's looking at everything from the position of a very small, limited, narrow perspective, and not seeing the fact that we live in an abundant world that's full of the amazing gifts of all different peoples, and that it's more like we're impoverished by not being able to be open to them.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a critical reframing as we try to navigate this really interesting time where we're dealing with both the scarcity of climate change and the ways in which resources have been mismanaged, and the abundance of these kind of surplus technologies that, according to the CEO of Microsoft, if wielded in a just way and in an equitable way, could solve housing, education, healthcare, and food scarcity for every person on the planet. And this isn't new. We've been faced with abundant technologies in the past, like solar power, existing 10 years before fossil fuel technologies. Why did we go the route of fossil fuel versus solar power technology? Maybe it made a more business sense because there was a more manageable revenue threshold on something that has to be excavated from the earth versus something that's abundant around us all the time. But those are the kinds of decisions where at those kinds of crossroads again, where we have to make choices about how we're going to wield these powers. I mean, that same tool of artificial intelligence could create the worst income inequality that human history has ever seen on a scale that is kind of unimaginable at this point. Yes. So we do have choices. Going back to this idea of kind of reframing it from the idea of like, I'm not having the same kind of resistance, at least in the communities that I'm in conversation with, because it's not, I'm trying not to frame it as a us and them, but a real shared prosperity. And one of the ideas that are coming out in terms of what kind of design principles are we using to imagine the future. One is design justice, which there's a book coming out by Sasha Costanza-Choke from MIT on this. There's a design justice network. There's other ways of people calling it ethical design practice. I can't remember all the new terminology that's coming out about this. But even that, which is a huge, wonderful shift in thinking, human-centered design is wonderful. It's trying to consider the whole customer in its design, but it's still thinking from a consumer-specific basis instead of ecosystem levels of kind of shared prosperity and well-being across a society. And these ideas like design well-being and emergent strategies and these things that are coming out are trying to think of a more ecosystem, or future-centered design is another one that I just heard out of the design school. That's not just saying about humans, but other living entities that are in our future besides just human beings. Still, to me, that is the baseline. When you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm like, designing for justice over this next century, that is the baseline. That should be a given. Making sure that we're not creating addictive design that creates mental health issues and suicide. Baseline. That's not a noble thing. That's something that isn't arguable. Yeah, you don't design for addiction.
Here's something, Kamal. If designing for justice is the ideal, but if you think about how we can make this palatable for just somebody listening who's thinking, well, how do I get my mind around having a just world, because that's a pretty big project. What about designing for safety? If people feel safe to express themselves, if they feel safe to access resources or to ask to have access to resources, if they feel safe to work in environments where they're not going to be misjudged and treated badly, maybe safety is the key to get started.
I think that's a great thing. I think it's actually an article around lack of safe spaces is one of the key concerns that came up when I did this research for the Ford Foundation. So I think that's an astute observation. If you look at the Design Justice Network's principles, that's one frame on it that I think is easily consumable. They've got a set of, I think it's 15 principles that really help. I think safety is part of what the outcome is, but things like before we come in with a whole, new revolutionary system of innovation, why don't you look at what's actually working within the community right now, and how do you really do a deep dive on how any systems level change or local level change, really what is the impact on the community? What is that? And how are they in the conversation, in the consultation? How is their mutual benefit instead of extractive relationships? Just things that are, they're not rocket science. And it may feel very overwhelming by the word justice, but when you look at these 15 simple principles, they're not rocket science. They're stuff that should come with decent moral compass, you know what I mean? And I think we're starting to get there, like the stakeholder business model frameworks that are evolving that help to loosen us up from only creating shareholder value only as a metric for success or for fiduciary duty, that we're starting to open up a little bit more to understanding the kind of traditional models of organizations have been a bit myopic in terms of their interdependence, right? But what I was saying before is that I think justice feels like eat your broccoli, you know what I mean? Like, and that's okay. We need that for sure. But I also like to say, well, if we design for well-being, it's not just a eat your broccoli, it's the next level up of sense of thriving. And if we design for shared prosperity,
I love that. Yeah, I love that. It's not eat your broccoli. It's not about giving up chocolate bars. It's about well-being, which is a whole different framework. So you're really articulate, intellectual, and artistic, and capable of understanding things at a very deep level, and also excellence as an artist, right? There must have been some times when you ran across people where you just felt like, oh, I'm hitting a wall here because what's normal to me is not normal to them. Can you think of a time when that might have happened to you?
Oh, yeah. It's really interesting. I can think of a lot of times. One thing that I hit all the time, when I was working at the Woodruff, I was on a team that won a $12 million grant for arts education in Georgia, but it was so much of the work was just trying to defend the investment in the arts, right? When the communities, all kinds of socioeconomic issues that people just wanted to, surgically deal with, which is important. Like, how do we make sure the kids have food in the morning? Do they have to have a music program? If you have to do the trade-off. There's some people that just understand, even if they're not an artist, they've had a transcendent experience with the arts, and they understand that it has intangible factors on what makes a healthy society, right? It creates a sense of purpose. It creates a sense of well-being. It creates a sense of mental health indicators, of being able to kind of manage some of those health indicators. They did a big study on theater students, and they found that theater students, as they evolved into the workplace, were light years ahead of their peers in terms of being able to lead from a collaborative perspective and to be able to put themselves in other people's shoes and deal with empathy and equity in the workplace.
And pick up on social cues. So just trying to constantly try to communicate to people that have a much more utilitarian understanding of what makes a healthy functioning society is a constant challenge, but an important one. Like, we're doing this Future of Culture initiative with Sundance in partnership with Stanford University. And to their credit, they had seen what we were doing with New Frontier, this intersection of art, science, and technology, and the richness of, and the real rigor of these artists, scientists, technologists. Like, they weren't doing surface science or surface technology. They were really developing deep learning machines, and they were really doing biohacking, and they were able to hold their own in a science community or in a technology community, but also be artists. And so Stanford asked us, because they are at that intersection in Silicon Valley, I said, we'd like to partner with you because we did a big survey, a big review of the culture at Stanford, and saw that basically because the arts had been so marginalized, there's like a generation of leadership that came out of Stanford in the technology sector that was not able to fully manage and wield the power of their technologies for the wider culture. And we've seen some of that with the Tech Won't Build It movement and the Center for Humane Technology, kind of this backlash against some design within Silicon Valley that didn't consider the whole kind of cultural ecosystem and also the well-being. And so Stanford has made a commitment to make sure that they're going for a STEAM curriculum, and every single student that walks on campus has a real engagement with the arts. And that's huge. Yeah,
and to be able to be at the
STEAM.
table. But trying to communicate why STEAM, not STEM only, is important, I think, is one of those major challenges. And then I'll say one more thing about that. At the lab that we run at New Frontier, we're bringing artists, scientists, technologists onto a mountain, right? And we've had moments where, I'll bring in some augmented reality from a big tech company incubator developer, and the opening reception, they'll lean into me and be like, I'm sitting next to an Oscar award-winning filmmaker. Am I the right person to be in the room? Like, I feel so out of place, and then the Oscar award-winning filmmaker would turn to me and go, I'm standing next to this, augmented reality, virtual reality, AI code developer. I'm so intimidated. Am I in the right room? Did you really mean to invite me?
Hey, safety and well-being.
Yeah. And I was just like, you both are exactly the right people that need to be in the room. And there's this amazing moments where we would see things like, a theater person from NYU that had never even probably touched anything outside of an analog technology, kind of bring an insight to some of the top game developers in the world that broke some of the rules of thumb about character development so that they could help their storytelling reach levels of catharsis that theater and film reached. So it was just these moments where once they got over those imposter syndromes and they got over the kind of semantic barriers. And then I remember this one developer from Intel at the end of the week, he said in our kind of closing wrap session, he said, I now understand that storyteller development is almost identical to product development in technology. You kind of look at the issue, you go through this kind of rigorous R&D process, you refine, you bring it to market. And it was just this wonderful moment where, you can kind of bridge what seems like two totally different languages, alien languages, and say, oh, we're actually doing the same thing. It's creative work, and we can find ways to bridge those gaps.
I really like that because it's talking about bridging, like finding ways where people can have an aha moment with the other group rather than just saying, oh, no, this just feels really odd and I feel very intimidated or like I don't belong. You're saying what are the things that can bridge, which was great. Makes me wonder, how do people hire artists then? How do they get the best out of an artist if they're employing an artist? What would be some tips that you might have?
Well, it's a great question. When I interviewed, there was a big call from a lot of sources to try to help break the silos between business and arts and technologists, engineers and scientists. And I got a lot of feedback, a lot from people that were either trying to create space for artists to be included into a process that wasn't fundamentally an arts process or vice versa. And one of the things that I spoke with this incredible technologist/artist who did an artist residency at Google, and he said, kudos to Google for creating space for artists, but I think, we need to evolve how we understand artist residencies within these organizations. He said, I kind of felt like I was put into a room with a lot of fun toys and kind of left to myself for a while. He said, I wasn't really engaged with the intellectual and creative community, and I wasn't able to be in a consultation around this stuff that would actually have any impact on the direction of how the company is moving these technologies into our culture.
So community, don't just isolate the artists, engage them in the community.
And then I spoke with an artist and a professor at the New School, incredible artist. She did a project called Care Force, and she shared a research project she did on artist residencies, and she said that we were actually way better at this in the middle of last century. Even some kind of public waterworks at some major city had an artist in residency program. She talked about Rauschenberg at Bell Labs, and she talked about how rigorous and robust and how normal it was to have artists engaging with our industries in interesting ways, and how that died in the 80s. And we've kind of been less for it in terms of the design culture.
So we're getting to the end of the interview here. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to say or something you'd like to promote that you would like people to pay attention to as a result of this interview. I
think one of the big learnings that I've had is, and I've been doing this exercise with different groups around the country, trying to create a process to mitigate our own blind spots within our leadership and within our organizations. And it's not always an easy process. I'm now, as an executive director, not just a director, I've had to face my own challenges with creating a really inclusive way of designing collaboratively and how we're accepting feedback so that we can design the best systems and the best products and so forth. I always use the analogy of the Columbia Space Shuttle and how when I was in grad school, we had to read a business case study around why that tragedy happened. And a big learning from NASA was that they had created so much of a hierarchical mode of management that a lot of the voices from the margins or of the organization were not able to penetrate into the leadership and decision-making. And that's how they missed this little tiny, simple miss that caused that explosion. And so the person who is closest to the job is the expert, not the person who has the most education. Yes. And I think about that in terms of culture at large. If we are following the same kind of innovation cycles that happened with the industrial revolutions of the past, or even the emerging television or film kind of moments, or not having democratized power, or not having a kind of an opportunity for the margins to penetrate into the main part of decision-making, created some major issues like climate change out of the Industrial Revolution, not including indigenous voices who had a strong value system around stewardship of the earth, or film perpetuating the
stereotype,
kind of
inequity.
stereotypes.
Yeah.
I applaud the effort that's being made now to correct those things that happened 100 years ago, the trajectories that started 100 years ago. But how can we mitigate some of those pain points now by learning our lesson, by creating a more inclusive leadership model?
Do you have one suggestion?
Yeah, that would be my big takeaway personally, and hopefully that's useful to others.
Yeah, it will be. But one practical suggestion that people could take to start living in a more just way and incorporating more diverse viewpoints, including the arts, what's one thing people could do?
Well, I would say adopting this design for the margins first principle. Universal design practice is another way of saying it. But when you consider the person with the least access to what you're creating as your primary customer, then everybody benefits. Universal design practices use text messaging as an example because it was designed for people that could not use phones because they were deaf in the traditional way. And so, but that text messaging has become something that has benefited, how much adoption has, how much communication happens through that now. So designing for the most marginalized person actually benefits everybody, not just the marginalized person.
That's a wonderful thing to end on. Thank you, Kamal, so much for spending the time and energy explaining all these things and answering my questions and putting up with me interrupting and asking you to define things. I really applaud your work, and I think it's important and transcendent work, and thank you for being part of the Culture and Leadership Connections community.
Well, thank you so much for having me and listening to me ramble. It's very kind of you.
Have I got a great surprise for you? It is our Future of Work 3 stellar articles that will explain how you can stay current and skilled now and in the future of work. We have 3 pieces to this. It's a free download called The Future of Work, and in part 1, I talk about how people and machines came to be in relationship together and how the gig economy affects everything. In part 2, I talk about the relationship between Industry 4.0 and emotional labor and what you will need as far as skills are concerned in the tech and soft skills for the future. And in part 3, I talk about a 2020 vision for the future of work, which is going to help us move forward into a future that is kinder and more oriented towards humanity living in relationship with its environment, along with some very practical suggestions for how to get there. I know you're going to love it, and you can easily download it by going to this link. The link is shiftworkplace.co/future of work white paper. Let me say that again. It's shiftworkplace.co/future of work white paper. Grab your copy today, and I would love it if you get back to me and let me know what you think.
Imagining bold ideas for the future. That is the purpose that drives Kamal Sinclair's leadership and sense of community. Growing up in an arts family in Hollywood, she was soon recognized as having outstanding dancing and acting ability, but she did not stop there. From the age of 9, Kamal has been a pioneer in the arts, business, and technology when she was first recruited to dance in an international dance workshop that performed around the world. As an adult, combining the ability to create art for social justice, dance and create film at an internationally recognized level of excellence, set budgets, and organize workflows would already be enough of a skill set. Yet Kamal has another critical ability. She can translate the processes of AI technology to artists and artistic experience to software creators so they can better collaborate. Her goal? To build open spaces for people of all backgrounds and economic levels to speak their truth through the arts. And if anyone can take on this monumental project, Kamal Sinclair is the right woman for the job. I hope you were as inspired as I was by Kamal's thinking, and that you will share this podcast and others with friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast, and may connecting with people across cultures, disciplines, and professions continue to guide and inspire your day.